Good morning. Thank you for joining us today at MMPC 2021. I am so excited to be with you today. My name is Michelle Sourie Robinson, and I'm the President and CEO of the Michigan Minority Supplier Development Council. This morning's keynote is really more of a virtual fireside chat with none other than Dr. Bernice King, the daughter of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, who is now the CEO of the King Center. We invited Dr. King because we'd like for her to really talk to us more about her father's impact on economic equality, because he knew that that was the path to true equality. Before we bring Dr. King live to the stage, what I'd like to do is share a bit of the backdrop with you. So the slides that you're about to see are really coming from our last presentation on the 333 years to parity. For those of you that are just joining us, I want to take this opportunity to bring you up to speed on the research that we are actually introducing publicly today for the first time. When we began to look last year, and you can go to the next slide, when we began to look last year at the historical perspective of supplier diversity programs in the wake of a pandemic that had ravaged much havoc on the country, but also when we looked at the murder of George Floyd and the impact that that was having on our nation, we began to talk about racial injustice. We saw many corporations come to the forefront with very moving, inspiring statements about their commitment to equity. In addition to that, we saw that we had many businesses in light of the pandemic and the many shutdowns that were required for safety. We saw many of our businesses being adversely impacted, truly exponentially. So when you looked at some of our businesses, they were shutting down at rates of sometimes 3 and 4 times their counterparts. And it called to us the idea to really talk about the history of diversity, because you see, oftentimes when corporations are speaking about diversity, they're speaking about check writing programs, really supporting very well-deserved non-governmental organizations, NGOs, nonprofits, by supporting them with check writing. What we're talking about, however, is a sustainability that communities themselves can sustain if they're simply giving access and opportunity. This came about, as you see in this slide, in 1968. Dr. King was unfortunately assassinated in April of 1968, and following that time, there were periods of great unrest. The president at the time, President Nixon, wanted to understand the source of that unrest. And one of the quotes that we always hear now, as we've gone through this last year, we often hear people saying riots are the language of the unheard, another Dr. King quote. But the true goal of the government at the time was to simply say, what is causing the rioting and how do we stop it? A law and order presidency that was really looking at how do we quell the anxiety, obviously within minority and in particular the Black community. From that was created an economic development organization at the federal level called the Minority Business Development Agency today, as we know it. That agency actually helped to fund the National Minority Supplier Development Council. And the reason for this is the government, I believe, originally, if you talk to some of those that were literally a part of that movement at the time, the government originally set out with the intention that they could right these wrongs and correct the ills so that there was economic equity. They soon realized that was virtually impossible without the support of private corporations. And that is when the National Minority Supplier Development Council and others like us were formed and created to be able to have a public-private partnership that helped to address the economic inequity issues in minority, in particular at that time, the Black community. Let's fast forward 50 years. And in 2020, we saw the murder of George Floyd call to question some of the same issues. The next slide shows you, however, the true results and impact. This is quite monumental because when you look at it over the 50 years since Dr. King's assassination and those original rioting that took place, you find that what has happened is we have more than 1,000% growth in the number of minority firms that gross over $1 million a year. That is outstanding. Minority businesses are growing and at a pace, and opening, I should say, at a pace that's 1,000% when you look over the last 50 years. What's not growing, however, is the gross receipts of those firms. When you look at that number, we've grown barely 1% in 50 years. Today, the latest economic data from the federal government shows that minority firms grossing over $1 million a year are only at 2.6% of minority firms. Only 2.6% of minority firms gross over $1 million in annual revenue. That brings me to our conversation today. If you go to the next slide, you'll see one of my favorite quotes from Dr. King that really guides our work. If our goal is genuine equality, it means economic equality. So let's look at the data. The gap is widening. When you look at the wealth on the next slide of white households, you see the tremendous gap there in the wealth that is there. You literally see that it's 8 times that of Black households, and I believe it's 5 times that of Latino households. That's what the graph there is showing you. In addition, if you go to the next slide, economic inequality persists. At this growth rate, which is about 0.6% every 5 years, it will take us 333 years. That's right, 3 centuries to achieve economic parity. As I explained in our session, as we introduced this analysis, we looked at many ways to measure equity. And the best solution that we found was parity, not because we're asking for some inequitable system that removes wealth from one group and places it with another. We're simply asking for access, because we believe if minority firms have equal access, true access, to compete for the lucrative contracts, not simply the ones that are 1 to 2 years in duration and are low margin, low growing, but to compete in the areas and in the industries that have the greatest impact, we believe we can drive wealth in minority communities that is sustainable and that is impactful and achieves true, genuine equality. The next slide, I think, is one of the more telling. What does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't have enough money to buy a hamburger? And I think if you look at our work over the last 50 years, we have achieved the growth. There's an integrated lunch counter. But at the end of the day, we don't have enough wealth in our communities to actually be able to buy that hamburger. So what can we do today to make progress? These next slides actually share that with you. Next slide. If we look at what corporations are spending today, we believe the average corporation spends 3.29% to total. When we look at only excluding payroll and taxes, we know a lot of corporations like to exclude all of these categories and have huge percent to total numbers, but they're really inaccurate and misstate the truth. We look at the real data, and it shows that about 3% of is the average for most corporations. That target, however, for parity needs to be about 13 to 16%. If we do that and we simply grow minority firms 1% every year, we can achieve the economic parity that we seek in not 333 years, but if you look at the next slide, we can do so in 15 years. And that's our challenge to you today. It's not because we are looking at some socialist system and asking for handouts. In fact, it's just the opposite. This final slide here shows you that by doing this, we can add $8 trillion to our GDP. The only countries that have a GDP of that size are the US and China. So I can assure you that all communities are losing when every community is not included. That is the reason that I'm excited to have with us today none other than Dr. Bernice King. We thought there was no one more fitting to have this conversation with us because we believe her father was the impetus to this movement that we call supplier diversity. He's often credited for a civil rights movement, but that movement was steeped in economics as well. So we'd like to bring to the stage Dr. Bernice A. King. Dr. King is a global thought leader, strategist, orator, peace advocate, and the CEO of Martin Luther King Jr. Center for the Nonviolent Social Change, the King Center, which was founded by her mother, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, truly an unsung hero. In this position, Dr. King continues to advance her parents' legacy of Kingian nonviolence, which she has rebranded as Nonviolence 365. Dr. King graduated from Spelman College with a BA in psychology with a concentration in pre-law, and from Emory University with a Master of Divinity and Doctor of Law. She is a noted author, and to her credit has a book entitled Hard Questions, Heart Answers, a compelling and inspiring piece. Dr. King is an innovative and transformational leader dedicated to taking her parents' legacy and teachings, the King Center, and the work of creating a more just, humane, equitable, and peaceful world with the Nonviolence 365 into a new era. Welcome, Dr. King.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Michelle. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us all the way here in Michigan. I miss my Atlanta family, so
yes, we miss you.
Yeah, thank you for being a part of this. As you saw in those pieces there, your parents' legacy is such a formidable one, and I think is a guide for so many of us as we do this work. But I often think about the fact that most people don't see the work of your father in particular as steeped in looking at the economy. He knew that it was important for people to have that equity. So my first question to you is that people often speak, for example, about things like the March on Washington, but few realize its full name was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which indicates there was an economic focus to the march. Can you describe what role economics played in the march and your dad's overall messaging?
So, Michelle, I just want to say that's probably one of the most important questions of the day. And I want to say that because when people understand the context of what was happening during the March on Washington, it gives a better perspective on why we are where we are today. I want to put it, though, in a historical context in terms of an organization or a department that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which my father was one of the 100 co-founders of. It was founded by 100 ministers predominantly in 1957 to basically do away with de jure legal segregation in the South. And in 1962, they decided to create an effort to address economic inequity, economic injustice, to in fact improve the economic conditions, in particular related to Black Americans. And it was called Operation Breadbasket. So that was in 1962. And the crust of it is, if you respect my dollar, you must respect me. You must treat me with dignity. And so they would call on corporations. They would look at the stats of corporations to see how many Blacks they had hired at the time, and in what positions, and the pay. That they were able to do that back then. If they did not find any Blacks, didn't have them at a certain pay, and there were not paid on parity. There was not parity in pay. Then they would make certain demands. If those demands weren't met, then they would employ economic withdrawal as a leverage tool to get those demands met. So that was the context of the SCLC that my father led at the time, leading into the March on Washington. And I want to just report out that, in fact, through Operation Breadbasket, 15 million at the time, which I don't know, probably translates into hundreds of millions now, was added to the Black economy in Chicago, 25 million in Atlanta. And these are real numbers. People need to know that. My father did make some economic impact. And there were other cities too, Cincinnati and others. I think they did their work in 15 cities in the United States of America. But coming into the March on Washington, with that understanding that many Blacks at the time were working low wage jobs, and we call them the low wage, low paying jobs. One of the reasons that they wanted to ensure that jobs was a part of the March on Washington. And so that's where you see the jobs aspect, the underemployment and the unemployment addressed. But I want to read this because I think it's important for people to understand, because most people have never done this and they don't know this history, and it's important that they know this history. Right. In 1963, as you said, it was a March on Washington for jobs and freedom. And they had 10 demands. And I want to go through them real quick because I want people to hear them. Because if you hear them, it sounds like these are the same demands today that we need. And it will draw the conclusion that we are 58 years behind. Okay. So the first one was a comprehensive and effective civil rights legislation from the present Congress without the filibuster. There's filibuster going on right now on voting legislation. And so that legislation would have access to all public accommodations, decent housing, adequate and integrated education, the right to vote, withholding of federal funds from programs in which discrimination exists, desegregation of all school districts. Because remember, we had Brown versus Board of Education, but the schools were still segregated. So legislation is not enough. Something else has to happen. So desegregation of all school districts in 63, enforcement of the 14th Amendment, reducing congressional representation of states where citizens are disenfranchised from the vote. A new executive order banning discrimination in all housing supported by federal funds. Authority for the Attorney General to institute injunctive suits when any constitutional right is violated. Many of these are on the civil rights side, but now we're getting to the economic side. A massive federal program to train and place all unemployed workers, Negro and white, the language at the time, on meaningful and dignified jobs at decent wages. A national minimum wage act that will give all Americans a decent standard of living. At that time, they were trying to raise it from, I believe it was somewhere around 110, 105, 110 to $2. $2 today translates into $17, and people are calling for $15. So they were well ahead. Right. A broad and fair labor standards act to include all areas of employment which are presently excluded, and a federal Fair Employment Practices Act barring discrimination by, and this is where supplier diversity comes into place, by federal, state, and municipal governments, and by employers, contractors, employment agencies, and trade unions. So everything you revealed earlier is right on point in terms of the foundation that my father and them were seeking to lay. Had they been able to get those demands met in 63, then once the 64 Act passed, there probably wouldn't have been a need for the 65 Voting Rights Act. As you see, that was part of the 63 demand. The Federal Housing Act of 68, there probably wouldn't have been a need for that. I mean, we can always tweak things, improve things, of course, and on and on. And certainly today, we would be well past this discussion about minimum wage. And in 68, when my father did the Poor People's Campaign and called for that, he probably would not have had to call for it at the level that he called. At the time, he was calling for a Poor People's Campaign because we still did not have a fair minimum wage. And for him to push it further, he was pushing for a livable wage, a livable wage. And there's discussions about that now across our country. And more radically, he was calling for a radical redistribution of wealth. And so when he spoke, he was speaking in the context of those social and economic inequities and injustices that existed at the time. That's why you hear the language about the bad check that returned with insufficient funds. That's when you hear we will not be satisfied, until the Black person can be able to go into motels and hotels and not have to, because back here then, as you know, Michelle, we had the Green Book. We had to look for places that were safe spaces for Blacks to stay because of discrimination. You know, we couldn't just lay our head at any hotel along the highways and the freeways. And so, excuse me, you know, these are all of the things that he was speaking to. We talked about police brutality, you know, until we dealt with that, we will not be satisfied. And then he laid out this massive vision after he talked about the economic state and he talked about the social state of America. He laid out this massive vision but we can get there. That's where the I Have a Dream came in. And he started talking about an inclusive economy, inclusive society. And so, you know, that was the context of the '63 March on Washington. And I hope some people really glean some insight on that, because I think most people were caught up in the oratory of King. Exactly. And yes, he was a fantastic orator, but more importantly, my father was a strategist and a solutionist. Right. And so he spoke from that platform, and that's what made him effective.
Outstanding. I'm sitting here just blown away, as I know our audience is, at that cliff notes of history that you just provided us, but from a very unique perspective, because the reality is, as you listed those 10 things, you're right. We could be listing the same 10 things today. So it is a bit astonishing that we're still there. But when I think about the 10, not only are we looking at supplier diversity impacting the true spending piece of that, but if you look at the reason we certify minority businesses, it is because we know they over-index in hiring and promoting. You talked about the lucrative jobs. That's critical. Our businesses, one of the requirements for certification is that in that key leadership position, the most prominent position in the company, one that's making the active day-to-day decisions, that be a person of color. And the reason that isn't that we're just trying to tell people what to do, but it's because we know that not only does that create wealth for the entrepreneur, but now creates wealth for the staff and the employees and the businesses that will then be employed and have an opportunity through that ecosystem. That is a message that I think people miss. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that history lesson you just gave all of us, even those of us that believe we're astute and have read your father's teachings, but have also learned about our history so that we don't repeat the same mistakes. To have you just explain that was a priceless moment. So
can I add one thing, Michelle, that I failed to say? From early on in around 1953, 54, before the movement started, my father clearly understood that racial and economic injustice were inseparable twins. And so, you know, as you said early on, he was not just focused, you know, on creating the non-discriminatory society in terms of Blacks being able to have, you know, opportunity to go into a restaurant, but he also wanted to integrate the money, so to speak, not just the society, but the money.
Absolutely. Because as you said, if we had been able to do that, if your father had been able to achieve that, you wouldn't have needed the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. You might not have needed all of those things to try to legislate the human heart and the standard, right?
Exactly.
I see us here today at the same place. So you've kind of, I wanted to talk about the Poor People's Campaign, and you've really kind of done that. So I want to talk instead about when you think about, because I know many people have now taken that monitor and we have that moniker, and we've got a new Poor People's Campaign movement of sorts. But what I'd really like to understand from your perspective, because I know you're constantly out teaching and educating about your parents' message, is when you look at the corporations and their involvement, what is your message to the nation's major corporations?
Look, when everything happened last year, one of the things that with George Floyd and all of the others, one of the things, and the corporation started responding. One of the things that I had been talking about well in advance of all of this, I felt like I was kind of like a lone voice out in the desert somewhere and nobody could hear me. But in 2000, as the century changed, because I've been speaking now for about 41 years, I talked to my mother one day and I said, look, during you all's time, the focus was heavily on government responsibility to society. I think we've moved into an era of corporate social responsibility. And this was before, the corporations started looking at, corporate social responsibility, social impact. And so as I was having these discussions, one of the things I said is it's important, in my perspective, that corporations really look at creating an agenda that can support social justice and can support racial equity. Of course, that agenda, in my opinion, should be created from an inside out approach, meaning, or inside and an outside approach, meaning that there should be people that are on the outside a part of helping those corporations as they work on the inside with what that looks like, so that we can come to an agenda that's a win-win for everyone. Corporations are always, as we know, concerned about a bottom line, but we're in day and age post-pandemic now, that we are really going to have to think about how we all share in the responsibility and in the sacrifice. African Americans have been sacrificing and even suffering for centuries. And so it's now time that there be some sharing of this kind of, you don't want to call it suffering, but I'll just say sharing of this sacrifice. And so corporations can do a great deal. I remember when I spoke to Oracle, I said, Oracle, you're the size of a nation, literally. Oracle could adopt low-performing schools all around this nation and could help to bridge the gaps in those low-performing schools, whether we're talking about technology, whether we're talking about helping to improve the academics by providing, tutoring and allowing some of what the employees do to be on their clock. I mean, it's okay if your employees give 6 hours a day and 2 hours to society. It's okay to do that. It's not going to take away from the bottom line. It makes you a richer corporation, in fact. And so these are the kind of things that I talked about. And so I saw early on, at that time, Delta had made a commitment to adopt an Atlanta school district. They made a commitment to looking at using and leveraging their lobbyists to work on legislation now because of what happened in Georgia, and many of the corporations being called out and called up. We got to stop using language that people are just calling people out. And if they are, I challenge them to call them up. We need to call corporations up into responsibility, because you wouldn't be who you are today were it not for the customers. Exactly. And those customers are part of the community, and those communities and those customers have challenges and issues that we need the support of the corporations from. And so we may not be formally stockholders, but the stockholders wouldn't be who they are were it not for the customers. Exactly. So technically, we are critical stakeholders. And so our voice and our issues and our concerns have to be championed as well. And so, yes, there has to be public-private partnerships moving forward and looking at it in terms of how do we correct what has happened in the past. We have a campaign now at the King Center called Be Love. And it's based off of my father's words, where he said, power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And he said justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. Huh. And so We're in that corrective stage. And so there's legislation that we have to correct. That's why there's police reform legislation now on Capitol Hill to correct some of the things that are going on in policing. And so corporations have a lot of power and leverage that can accelerate social change.
Right. And you're so right, though. Their power and leverage it benefits them as well, because they fuel the ecosystem of their customers, their shareholders, their communities. We all benefit when any community sees an increase in graduation rates, a decrease in crime rates. All of those things impact all communities. You know, the late Vernon Jordan said, when he was going to head up the National Urban League, that if he could uplift the Black community, all communities benefit. And that's what you just said. Let's call corporations up, because we all benefit. And I would also say that you actually help the corporations' bottom line, because when you look at that $8 trillion in GDP that we're missing out on because our racial inequities aren't there, we're all missing out on that. Why wouldn't we want to capitalize on that $8 trillion that's there? So, right, you've talked to corporations, but I also know, and probably from my time in Atlanta, looking at the legacies of people like Herman Russell, I know the impact of minority entrepreneurs, people of color that have been in business, and those entrepreneurs' impact on the movement. When I went to Pascal's and listened to the Zernona Claytons recount their stories of how the Black businessmen undergirded this movement, I also look at the responsibility of our business owners. We have many minority entrepreneurs watching, and one of the things I challenge them to do is over-index in hiring and promoting. Don't just keep the people of color in the lower ranks of your organization, but we ought to see them flourishing throughout. In addition to that, you ought to have some of the best and strongest supplier diversity programs in your own business, so that you can look and say, I am spending X percentage with other minority firms. When you look at the role and the history that I think you possess, that is just so amazing. But when you look at the role that people of color have played as entrepreneurs, as the key influencers, how would you suggest that the average entrepreneur make an impact today?
Well, in addition to everything, because I think you answered the question, everything you said, and I don't want to repeat that, but it's a mindset that I want to speak to. Okay. And I said earlier that my father was a solutionist, and entrepreneurs need to see themselves as solutionists, not going into business for their own personal wealth building, but to go into business to solve a problem directly or indirectly, you know, and look at ways that you can contribute to enhancing the social good, and contribute to social justice, because you're right. I mean, if it were not for Black businesses and even, you know, mom and pop businesses back then, I'm not sure where the movement would have been. I mean, there were a lot, you know, there was a story about a woman who was actually a lot of our folks from the South are great cooks, but she started, you know, cooking for the people who were part of the bus protest. But she used those funds to contribute to the continuation of that protest, because they, you know, they had to make sure that the people who were providing the alternative transportation were paid. And so there's so many different ways that entrepreneurs can give back to our community to deal with these gaps that we have. You know, one of the things that I want to encourage, we need more entrepreneurs in the tech space.
Yes.
I mean, really, I mean, when you think about where tech is and where tech has already started moving into, when you think about AI, we may be too late. I'm not sure. But if we live in the kind of inequitable society we live in now outside of tech, imagine what's happening as we're transferring that same inequity into the AI space, you know, because we're not there. We're not helping to influence that so that it is fair and that it's equitable. And so again, don't just say I want to start a business because I want to make money, but say I'm going to start a business because I was born to solve a problem.
Wow.
And I'm going to use my business prowess to solve that problem.
There's nothing wrong with doing well while doing good, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
And that is a solutionist. I like.
And I would say also, because this is one of the strains on our community, we are such a small percentage, significant percentage, but small. Instead of always thinking about my business, what about us organizing our business strengths into a larger business incubator, or even coming together in joint LLCs? You know, it never ceases to amaze me, you know, when I look around this nation, that there is nothing that I can identify industry-wise that Blacks lead. That's troublesome to me. You know, when you look at the service industry, I mean, we can go around. I mean, we need to think about that because we would have greater leverage power in terms of getting loans, in terms of being capitalized, and we could begin to create these enterprises. So we got to get out of the individual me space and move towards a more collective approach to entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. I have to say, I give my hats are off to the automotive industry. When I look back at the leaders, the CEOs, the chief procurement officers, and even a couple of supplier diversity leader legends from 20 years ago, they created the wealth that we see in some of our largest minority firms today. And they did that through what we call joint ventures, strategic alliances, pairing and bringing multiple MBEs together, just as you said. What concerns me about today is we don't have enough people leaving that type of legacy. We're still living off of the $50 million plus firms that were, quite frankly, undergirded and created by our foreparents. It's now time for our generation to leave that same legacy and close this gap. So you're exactly right. One of the things I want to shift gears and talk about came up this past week, and there was much debate over whether or not America is a racist country. What are your thoughts on that topic? Is America a racist country?
I would say yes. I think where people get confused is there's a discussion and understanding that we have to come to regarding what is a racist and what is racism. You know, my father described racism this way. It was power plus prejudice. A person who has a prejudice in their heart towards a group of people because of their race, arguably a racist. A person is a racist, but if they don't have the power, they're not part of a group that has the power to take that prejudice farther and begin to, you know, institutionalize it and legalize it. Then that person, if they're part of that, becomes a part of a group that has created racism in our systems and structures. And so I don't know how anybody can say this country is not a racist country. We have too many outcomes to prove that there is negative impact on the Black community. I mean, in every area, every industry, every arena, we are at the bottom. Is it because, you know, we're inherently incapable? No, we know that. Like you said earlier, when given the opportunity and access, we can compete with the best. But there have been systems and structures and practices, more importantly, put in place to continue to put obstacles in our way.
Yeah.
And if it's happening over and over again in different industries and the results are the same, that when we look at the data, at the bottom, Blacks.
Right.
We have half of the best and twice as much of the bad as the African American community. If that's not because of racism, I don't know what it is. I don't know what you call that. So it's not just a few bad apples. Because if we weed out, let me tell you something. We can weed out every bad apple in every industry. But do you know there are people that are good people today that work for corporations, they work for governmental entities, and because there are policies and practices that have been in place for decades, centuries, they too can carry forth that agenda that leads to racial outcomes that are discriminatory.
Mm-hmm.
Good people,
right.
They're not even aware of it.
Right.
And so, yes, we are very much a racist country, and we've got to come to terms with that, because as long as we're in denial, we will not be able to correct going forward. Mm-hmm. And things will continue to stay just as they are, and we'll be like South Africa. Mm. There's this whole notion that in the next, how many years now, because we've gone a few years, it's about next 20, 25 years, this country will be a majority minority, which I don't like the language minority and all that, but people of color will be in the majority. But if we don't deal with the racist systems,
right,
you can be in the majority like in South Africa and still exist under systems like apartheid.
Mm. Very true. I think everyone shudders at the thought that we are a racist country, regardless of who you are. It's sobering. But I do believe, my husband and I were actually talking about this recently, in trying to help people understand the systemic racism, mm-hmm. without being labeled as socialist or Marxist. I know your father endured some of those radical labels. I'm not a critical race theorist, but I, like you, see that we would have to believe a group of people is inferior to see them in housing, education, all economic factors. When you look at their relationships with the police, to always see the same groups. I'm looking at the hate inflicted upon Asian communities right now, sometimes with other people of color inflicting it. And we are in a mess as a nation, but I cannot help but group that with some of the systemic issues that take place. I believe those of us who have the ability to impact economics have the ability to change that. So hopefully you see glimmers of hope out there, that there are people who have awakened and said, we will not be a racist country if I can make a difference.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you see it today. If it pre-pandemic, I wasn't losing hope, but I was extremely discouraged. Mm-hmm. The beauty of today, unlike my father's time, is Black people are in the room. Mm-hmm. We weren't in the room back then. Right. To bring that level of consciousness and awareness. That's why, we do have a responsibility, although some of us feel like, why do we have to keep doing this? We have to keep doing it because it's irresponsible to leave people in ignorance, in hate, and in fear, mm-hmm. and other things. So while we're in these rooms, we have a responsibility to shed the light, so that we can make these necessary changes. People working in the room now, you have more people in the room, and you're going to always have the people in the streets. So in Daddy's time, it was more in the streets, and they had to maneuver into the room to negotiate. But now we have people in the room, and the alliance between the room and the people that are in the streets can be so powerful to create this change that we're talking about in terms of equity. And you mentioned something about my father in terms of socialist. In fact, my father proudly said that he was more socialist in his economic philosophy. He said that early on before the movement started to my mother in a letter. But he came to a place where he believed in a social democracy, which doesn't do away with capitalism, but it goes back into that corrective mode, that reforming mode, so that, where there are injustices, you can bring about more equal distribution of wealth. And so it's a gap filler. It helps to fill the gaps when you have a social democracy in operation. And that's where he was. I don't know how else we're going to do it in our current pure capitalistic state. And honestly, I believe the pandemic, is because I'm a spiritual person. I try to look at things spiritually as well. I believe there's signs and messages in this pandemic. And more importantly, there are things that we need to take time at as we continue to be in a semi-pause. We need to take time to really realign ourselves and look at what has worked and what is broken and what was intended from the beginning that now we have to kind of take to ground zero and create a new intention going forward. Because obviously, our economy is not as strong as we think it is, for the masses. We got to create a different kind of economy.
Powerful. We have to leverage our seat at the table. I mean, when I listen to that, I think of last year as people were beginning to march and the Black Lives Matter protest erupted. I remember talking to a millennial member of my family, and I said, I just need to get out and march. And he quickly corrected me. He said, that's not your role. Right. We're out here marching. You have to figure out and help us figure out where to take it from there and leverage your seat at the table to do it.
Exactly.
And that's what I say to so many listening today. We're going to open it up. Please do submit your questions. We only have a few precious minutes left with Dr. King, but what an amazing conversation this is. May we all have the courage to speak up and leverage our seat at the table.
Exactly.
There are people that paid a high price for us to have the seat, and we need to make sure it doesn't stop with us. One of the things I like about Vice President Harris's statement that she might be the first woman, but she won't be the last.
Yeah, exactly.
And we sometimes get so engrossed in our careers and our seat at the table that we forget we have a responsibility. I don't think I can ever be accused of that. If anything, they're trying to throw me out of the table for being so vocal, but I do think there's a nice balance there. There's a nice balance there. And I appreciate you calling that out. As we look for questions, I've got a couple of more questions of you. You mentioned it here, and I'd just like to know, how do you stay motivated? I can only imagine how it feels to have your father taken from you as he was for doing what was right, but then to continue to hear and see as much as you do day in and day out, as you are still so committed to being a leader and a light for change. How do you remain motivated?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's first and foremost my faith. I'm a part of a faith tradition where we triumph over evil, where we overcome difficulties and challenges. And so I use that as my encouragement when I get to those dark moments. I remember what my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ did and overcame, and it gives me that strength. But then I bring it into the natural. My parents and all of those who worked alongside of them, they didn't give up. They didn't quit. You know, you have moments where you get exasperated, you get tired. Take a break. Yeah. You know, take a mental break, take a physical break, but respect what my mother said, that struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. She used to tell me all the time, baby, when I felt like I was going to miss out on something, baby, problems will always be here and your time will come. And so I say to people, don't carry the burden that I always gotta be engaged, and yet don't not be engaged as well, because we do have a responsibility to this ongoing freedom struggle. And so I draw strength spiritually from Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit, and I draw strength from my parents' example. And then I just look out at the number of young people who in the last, golly, it's almost been 10 years, I think, since Mike Brown, that have refused to let up. You know, they are determined to make us reckon with this issue of race and Black Lives Matter. And I'm encouraged by that because it's young people. And the world changes when young people are actively engaged. That's what the movement, my father's movement, y'all, my father was, I'm older than my father was. I'm 58. My father was taken from us at 39. He started at 26. And many who surrounded him were younger than him. And so I'm always encouraged and inspired when I see young people get involved. That's when I told you earlier, I was almost discouraged. Because when I used to speak at college campuses, students seem to be so detached, indifferent, apathetic, complacent, you know, self-centered. And it's a different world now. Different world now.
No, you're exactly right. It is a totally different world. You mentioned your father's age, and I have to tell you, 20, 30 years ago when I first got to tour the King Center, one of the things that I'd never really thought about was how much he accomplished in such a short period of time. Yeah. So I have to tell you that for me, that empowers me and inspires me, that I cannot give up. I cannot throw in the towel. And I draw strength from that as well. You mentioned your mom, though, and we cannot end today without talking about her, because I think people know all of the work she did as a tireless advocate to ensure we commemorated your father in January each year for a national holiday. But I would venture to say we know more about your father's works because of your mother than the average person realizes. Can you tell us more about Mr. Scott?
My most favorite statement is that my father was one of the most hated men when he was assassinated. There was a poll during at that time in America. One of the most hated men when just before he was assassinated. He's now one of the most loved persons in the world. In his death, 53 years later. Why is that? Because a woman who did not just decide, okay, what do I do now that he's gone, but who was already very much intertwined into that movement, was an activist before she met Dr. King, a peace activist before she met Dr. King. And when they connected, she just was continuing on her journey and merged it with him, was able to carry forth and begin to lay the foundation to build the most popular social change justice brands still in the world, sustainable. I mean, you got to think about that. 53 years later, across this world, not just because we think in the context of USA, but across this world, people are studying Dr. King. They are looking to him for leadership and guidance in his death, because Coretta Scott King was very strategic from the time of his death, 2.5 months after announcing the establishment of the King Center that I'm now the CEO of, so that people would understand the teachings of Dr. King and how they contributed to social change. And so that's the work we do today. We educate and train people. And I invite people to come to our website at thekingcenter.org to find out about our numerous trainings, not just for social justice, but for creating a beloved community corporation, you know, for leading a nonviolent household, a classroom, and become a part of our Be Loved campaign. You can go to the website and find out about that and take the pledge as well, as we're on this journey to correct things, correct everything that stands against love and help to implement the demands of justice. But she built it from the ground literally up. She was a great coalition building, and she literally traveled the world first to talk about the work that they did in that movement. She talked about the impact that it had, because, you know, when people hear about impact, they want to join, they want to connect.
Right.
She talked about those powerful nonviolent teachings that we continue to teach on. And then when she came back from doing that tour, as she was building the King Center, she started sending things out to states and cities, asking them to commemorate her husband's birthday. So she built from the ground up the King holiday that people didn't realize was happening all along. While year after year, Congressman Conyers from Michigan was introducing legislation that wasn't passing, but he kept it on the table. So by the time she finished completing the King Center, institution of the King Center that represents the official living memorial of the life, work, and legacy of Dr. King, she can now focus on building this brand around the holiday. So now that the nation would be able to, year after year, at the beginning of every year, there is no irony that at the beginning of the year, we got to look at our conscience, because he was a leader of conscience.
Yep.
He was a leader of morality. He was a leader of do the right thing and do it the right way. So she helped to build all of this sacrificially, and at the same time was working legislatively on other things on Capitol Hill.
Right.
I mean, you know, from the women's movement, from the LGBTQ community to full employment, to some of the legislation we're dealing with now with gun control. She was involved in all of that. Right. So she popularized this brand, and now in 2001, over 100 nations commemorate the holiday. And I don't know how many Nobel categories there are, Nobel Prize categories there are. But out of all the Nobel Prize categories, the Nobel Institute told us that my father is the most sought after Nobel Prize laureate. They have 1 million visitors to their website. Over 50% are looking for Dr. King. Coretta Scott King sacrificed for that. But she was a great coalition builder and working from the ground up, because that groundswell that she created in the states and the cities is what met Washington, D.C. when it was time to pass the King holiday. So by the time she called together this coalition of 700 people in 1983 for the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington, she had a press conference in June. Within a couple of weeks of having that press conference, Congress passed the legislation for the holiday. It went on to the Senate, and then they converged on Washington, D.C. in August 28th of that year. And then in October, November is when the legislation was signed.
Look,
she's a bad sister.
Bad sister. That's the power of vision and of leveraging your seat. But it also sounds to me like a solutionist extraordinaire.
She definitely was a solutionist extraordinaire.
That generation.
You give her a problem like you do with most women. What are we gonna do?
Right. Exactly.
We're gonna solve it.
Exactly. We literally have 1 minute, and I don't want to lose 1 minute. When I look at the comments in the chat, you are impacting people, reigniting their fire, inspiring. If you could say in 30 seconds, where do they start? You know, this year we're literally my history is as an Oklahoman. We're commemorating 100 years since the Tulsa Race Massacre. We're looking at a year at the end of this month since George Floyd's murder. what I'm finding in the chat are, where do we begin? It's, economic withdrawal is one thing, but if you could say in 30 seconds to close us out today, where do we begin, Dr. King?
I think we begin by looking for institutions, entities, organizations that are doing the work, and aligning and connecting with them and using our gifts and talents with those organizations. A lot of times we try to reinvent a wheel. I think the solutions are out there. We have to attach ourselves to where they are and get in the wave of that. So that's how I would begin. We don't need something else created, please.
Let's collaborate. No,
yes, exactly.
Enough. I appreciate your team. Delise Drain just makes things happen. I cannot thank you for joining us here in Michigan today, Dr. King, and sharing what, for I believe everyone that's gotten to hear this today, is something we will never forget. So thank you for taking the time today as we embark on changing the 333 years to parity to less than 15. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great day.